Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, the architect of measured responses. Together and apart, they define the extremes of psychology's great divide, one reaching inward toward symbol and soul, the other outward toward observable mechanism and scientific precision. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the mystery of human behavior, one seeing compensatory dreams and archetypal patterns woven through the collective unconscious, the other discovering conditioned reflexes and the precise machinery of learning. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Pavlov as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the closing years of the 19th century, when the world stood balanced between gaslight and electricity, between faith and mechanism, between the old certainties and the new questions, two men began their separate journeys into the mysteries of the human being. They could not have been more different in their origins, their temperaments, or their visions of what it meant to understand the mind. Yet both would leave marks so deep upon psychology that even now, more than a century later, we feel the tremors of their diverging paths. Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in Keswil, a small village on the Swiss shore of Lake Constance, where mist rises from the water in the early morning and mingles with the dreams of those who dwell there. His father was a pastor, a man of cloth and scripture, though Jung would later recall him as spiritually empty, going through the motions of faith without its fire. His mother was more complex, more troubling. She seemed to Jung to possess two personalities, one conventional and maternal, the other strange and nocturnal, speaking with a voice that came from somewhere ancient and unknown. In that household, young Carl learned early that the visible world was only a thin membrane stretched over depths that most people refused to acknowledge. Jung's childhood was populated by visions and dreams that seemed more real than waking life. He dreamed of a vast underground chamber where a terrible god sat on a throne, and he understood somehow that this was the dark truth beneath the Sunday sermons. He carved a little wooden man and hid it in the attic with a painted stone, visiting it in secret, feeling that this figure held some essential part of himself that the ordinary world could not contain. These were not the games of childhood, but the first stirrings of a mind that would spend a lifetime insisting that the invisible realm, the realm of symbol, myth, and dream was as real and as important as anything that could be weighed or measured. By the time Jung entered medical school at the University of Basel in 1895, he had already decided that he wanted to understand the meeting place of matter and spirit, body and soul. He was drawn to psychiatry precisely because it occupied that ambiguous territory it dealt with the mind, which was somehow both physical and metaphysical, rooted in the brain, yet reaching toward meanings and symbols that transcended mere neurons. In 1900, Jung began his work at the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich under Eugen Bleuler, one of the most progressive psychiatrists of the age. There, among patients whose minds had fractured into pieces, Jung began his investigations into the unconscious, using word association tests to trace the hidden complexes that shaped thought and feeling. Jung's early work was empirical, scientific in the conventional sense. He measured reaction times, cataloged responses, sought patterns in the data. But unlike many of his colleagues, he never forgot that behind the numbers were human beings whose suffering was meaningful, whose symptoms were messages from depths they themselves could not access. When Jung met Sigmund Freud in 1907, it seemed at first like a meeting of kindred spirits, two men who believed that the unconscious was real and powerful, that dreams were not random noise, but communication from hidden realms of the psyche. For several years, they worked together, and Freud saw Jung as his heir, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. But the rupture between them was perhaps inevitable. Jung could not accept Freud's insistence that everything in the unconscious reduced ultimately to sexuality, to the personal history of repressed desires and childhood traumas. Jung sensed something older, something collective in the dreams and visions of his patients, images of gods and heroes, of dragons and great mothers, symbols that appeared across cultures and epochs with striking similarity. When the break came in 1913, it was catastrophic for Jung. He entered a period of psychological crisis that would last for years, a descent into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. During this time, Jung actively engaged with his own dreams and visions through a practice he called active imagination. He painted, he sculpted, he wrote down dialogues with figures who appeared to him as autonomous personalities emerging from his own depths. He met an ancient wise man named Philemon who walked with him in his garden and spoke wisdom that Jung felt he had not created but discovered. He encountered Salome and other archetypal figures. This was not madness, Jung insisted later, but a necessary journey into the collective unconscious, the realm of archetypes that lay beneath personal memory, the inherited patterns and potentials that shape human experience across all times and places. By the early 1920s, Jung had emerged from his ordeal with a new vision of psychology, analytical psychology, he called it, to distinguish it from Freud's psychoanalysis. At its heart was the idea that the psyche was not merely personal, but transpersonal, that dreams spoke not just of repressed wishes, but of compensatory messages from the unconscious, attempting to balance the one-sided attitudes of consciousness. Jung saw the psyche as purposive, as moving toward wholeness, what he called individuation. He studied alchemy, mythology, comparative religion, searching for the universal patterns of transformation that appeared in all cultures. He proposed that the psyche contained not just a personal unconscious of forgotten memories, but a collective unconscious populated by archetypes, the self, the shadow, the anima and animus, the great mother primordial images that structured human experience from the inside. Jung's psychology was symbolic, interpretive, hermeneutic. It dealt in meanings rather than mechanisms. When a patient reported a dream, Jung did not ask about conditioned associations, but about the symbolic resonances, the mythological parallels, the ways the dream might be commenting on the patient's current life situation or calling them toward a transformation they had been resisting. He believed that the psyche could not be understood from the outside, through observation alone, but only from the inside, through the careful attention to subjective experience, through imagination and intuition as well as intellect. Now let us turn to the other shore of this great divide, to a world that seems at first to have nothing in common with Jung's Zurich consulting room with its mandalas and alchemical texts, its sand play therapy and conversations about synchronicity. Let us travel to Russia in the middle of the 19th century, to a world of orthodox churches and vast distances, of scientific materialism fighting against religious tradition, of a culture trying to understand itself in the wake of profound social upheaval. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was born on September 14th, 1849, in the ancient city of Ryazan, southeast of Moscow. His father, like Jung's, was a man of religion, an Orthodox priest who served a poor parish and worked with his own hands to support his family. Young Ivan grew up in the shadow of church bells and incense, in a world of ritual and hierarchy, but he would turn decisively away from his father's faith toward the new religion of science. In 1870, at the age of 21, Pavlov abandoned his studies at the Ryazan Ecclesiastical Seminary and enrolled in the Natural Sciences program at St. Petersburg University. Drawn by the writings of Russian radical thinkers who proclaimed that everything, including human consciousness, could and should be explained through purely materialist principles. Russia in the 1860s and 70s was intoxicated with a particular vision of science, not the careful, humble accumulation of knowledge, but science as a revolutionary force that would sweep away superstition and mysticism, that would reduce all phenomena to matter in motion, that would reveal the mechanical laws underlying even the most apparently spontaneous human actions. The writings of Ivan Sechenov were particularly influential. Sechenov had argued that all psychical acts, without exception, could be understood as reflexes, automatic responses of the nervous system to external stimulation. Thought, feeling, well, all these were ultimately muscular contractions triggered by environmental conditions. There was no need to posit an inner realm, a soul, a subjective experience that transcended the physical. Everything was mechanism, everything was reflex. Pavlov absorbed this worldview completely. He became a physiologist, studying the digestive system with extraordinary precision and patience. His early work had nothing to do with psychology or behavior. He was interested in the glands, the secretions, the physical processes by which the body broke down food and absorbed nutrients. He developed surgical techniques that allowed him to measure these processes in living animals without interfering with their normal function. He would win the Nobel Prize in 1904 for this work on digestive physiology, long before he became famous for his studies of conditioning. But in the course of his digestive research, Pavlov noticed something curious. The dogs in his laboratory began to salivate not only when food was placed in their mouths, which was a straightforward reflex, but also when they saw the food, when they heard the footsteps of the assistant who brought the food, even when they saw the bowl in which food was usually served. This anticipatory salivation was a puzzle. It could not be explained by simple reflex action, because these stimuli, the footsteps, the bowl, had no inherent connection to food. The dogs had learned to associate them with food through repeated experience. For another scientist, this might have been merely an interesting observation, a complication to be controlled for in the experimental design. But for Pavlov, it became the doorway into an entire new science. If dogs could learn to salivate to arbitrary stimuli, then perhaps all learning, all adaptation, all apparently purposeful behavior could be explained as the formation of such associations between stimuli and responses. Perhaps the entire edifice of mental life, habit, emotion, thought itself was nothing but a complex network of conditioned reflexes built up through the individual's history of experience. Pavlov was 49 years old when he began his systematic studies of what he called conditioned reflexes. It was already 1900, the year Jung began working at Berkeley. For the next 3 decades, until his death in 1936, Pavlov would devote himself to elaborating the laws of conditioning with a rigor and precision that set new standards for experimental psychology. He built a laboratory where every variable could be controlled: the timing of stimuli, the intensity, the sequence. He measured salvation drops by drop. He recorded, he quantified, he sought mathematical regularities. His approach was the opposite of Jung's in almost every particular. Where Jung looked inward, Pavlov looked outward. Where Jung sought meaning, Pavlov sought mechanism. Where Jung embraced the mysterious, the symbolic, the irreducible, Pavlov insisted that everything could and must be reduced to observable events in space and time. The basic procedure of classical conditioning, as Pavlov elaborated it, was elegant in its simplicity. You begin with an unconditioned stimulus, something that naturally, automatically produces a response. Food in a dog's mouth produces salvation. This is an unconditioned reflex, built into the nervous system, requiring no learning. Then you pair this unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus, something that initially produces no particular response: a bell, a light, a tone. You present the bell, then immediately present the food. You do this repeatedly, dozens of times, hundreds of times. Eventually, the bell alone begins to elicit salvation, even in the absence of food. The neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and the salvation to the bell is a conditioned reflex. Pavlov saw this as the fundamental mechanism of behavioral adaptation. Through conditioning, the organism learns to respond not just to biologically significant stimuli, but to the signals that predict those stimuli. The world becomes readable, predictable. The animal learns the structure of its environment, encoded not in mental representations but in modified pathways through the nervous system, in strengthened connections between sensory inputs and motor outputs. Pavlov discovered many principles of learning through his conditioning experiments. He found that extinction could occur if you presented the bell repeatedly without the food. The conditioned response would gradually weaken and disappear. But even after extinction, the response could spontaneously recover after a rest period, suggesting that the learned association was not truly erased, but only inhibited. He discovered stimulus generalization, a dog conditioned to salvation to one particular tone, would also salivate to similar tones, with the response growing weaker as the new stimulus became more different from the original. He found discrimination by reinforcing salvation to one tone, but not to another. He could train dogs to respond only to specific stimuli. He explored higher-order conditioning, where a conditioned stimulus could itself serve as the basis for conditioning other stimuli, creating chains of learned associations extending further and further from the original unconditioned reflex. As Pavlov's work progressed, he became increasingly convinced that his principles applied not only to salvation in dogs, but to all behavior in all animals, including humans. Human language, he proposed, was a second signal system built on top of the first signal system of direct conditioned reflexes to sensory stimuli. Words were conditioned, stimuli of conditioned stimuli, abstract signals that had acquired meaning through their association with more concrete experiences. Human thought was nothing but internal speech, silent movements of the vocal apparatus, a whispered conversation carried on through conditioned verbal reflexes. Emotion, personality, neurosis, psychosis, all could be explained, Pavlov believed, as patterns of conditioning and higher nervous activity. Pavlov explicitly rejected introspection as a method for understanding the mind. He had no interest in what his subjects felt or thought or imagined. The inner life was inaccessible to science, he argued, because it was private, subjective, unreliable. One person's report of their experience could not be verified by another, but behavior, the measurable, observable responses of an organism to its environment, this was public, objective, replicable. A scientist in Moscow and a scientist in New York could observe the same dog salvation to the same bell and agree on what they saw. This was the foundation for a true science of psychology. The contrast with Jung could hardly be more stark. While Pavlov spent the first decades of the 20th century training dogs to salivate to metronomes in soundproof chambers, measuring responses to the fraction of a second, Jung was exploring the labyrinthine depths of the collective unconscious, interpreting dreams of medieval cities and mystical symbols, reading Gnostic texts and alchemical manuscripts, seeking the archetypal patterns that united human experience across millennia. While Pavlov insisted that psychology must restrict itself to observable behavior and reject all reference to consciousness or subjective experience, Jung insisted that consciousness and its relationship to the unconscious was the central mystery, that psychological science must be primarily interpretive, hermeneutic, attentive to meanings that could never be reduced to mechanical reflexes. These two men, born 26 years apart, shaped by vastly different cultural contexts, the orthodox materialism of late 19th century Russia versus the Germanic philosophical tradition of Switzerland came to represent two fundamentally opposed visions of what psychology could and should be. And yet, though they worked in different domains and spoke different languages, they were both responding to the same underlying question: what is the human being? What moves us, shapes us, determines our actions and experiences? How do we change, learn, grow, suffer, heal? Neither Pavlov nor Jung seem to have paid much attention to each other's work during their lifetimes. There is no evidence that they ever met, no correspondence between them, few if any references in their published writings to each other's ideas. They were simply too far apart in their assumptions, their methods, their entire approach to understanding the psyche. And yet, in the history of psychology, their names are forever linked as representing the two great poles of psychological thought, the mechanistic and the meaningful, the outer and the inner, the behavioral and the depth psychological. Pavlov died in 1936 at the age of 86, still working in his laboratory, still convinced that science would eventually explain all psychological phenomena through the principles of conditioning and higher nervous activity. Jung lived until 1961, dying at 85 in his tower at Bollingen, still exploring the mysteries of alchemy and synchronicity, still insisting that the psyche could never be fully explained by mechanical principles alone, that there was always something more, something irreducible, something numinous at the heart of human experience. As you begin to feel the weight of sleep settling over you like a soft blanket, like the dimming of lights in a theater before the show begins, let us pause for a moment to hold these two figures in mind together. Pavlov, in his white laboratory coat, peering at salvation measurements and timing devices, and Jung, in his study, surrounded by mandalas and African masks and ancient books, pen moving across paper as he records another dream, another vision, another message from the depths. Two very different ways of approaching the mystery of what it means to be human. Two very different answers to the question of how we become who we are. In the coming sections, we will explore more deeply the specific contrasts between their ideas, the ways their methods led them to such different conclusions about the nature of the psyche. We will consider what each saw that the other missed, what each contributed to our understanding, and whether there might be some way to honor both visions, to see them not as contradictions but as complementary perspectives on the vast mystery of human existence. But for now, simply rest with the images, the laboratory and the consulting room, the conditioned reflex and the archetype, the salvation drops and the dream symbols. Let them exist side by side in your imagination as you drift towards sleep. The great divide between Pavlov and Jung reflects a tension that runs through all of psychology, through all of human self-understanding. It is the tension between the view from outside and the view from inside, between the scientist and the artist, between reduction and interpretation, between explaining and understanding. Neither approach is simply right or wrong. Each reveals something essential. Each has its domain of application, its strengths and limitations. And the conversation between them, even when it was never explicitly spoken, continues to shape how we think about mind, behavior, consciousness, and self. Let us move now into the deeper waters of their contrasting visions, their different methodologies, the specific ways their approaches diverged, and what those divergences reveal about the many-layered reality of human psychological existence. But move slowly, gently, allowing the ideas to wash over you like waves, not demanding full waking comprehension, but simply letting the patterns and contrasts settle into your awareness as you descend into sleep. At the heart of the divide between Pavlov and Jung lies a fundamental question about the nature of learning and transformation. For Pavlov, learning was a mechanical process, the formation of new connections between stimuli and responses through the repeated pairing of events in time. An organism encounters a stimulus, a response occurs, and if that response is followed by a significant consequence, food, pain, satisfaction, danger, the connection between stimulus and response is strengthened. There is no need to invoke consciousness, intention, meaning, or purpose. The organism is shaped by its environment, the way water shapes a stone, through the accumulation of countless small effects over time. Pavlov's dogs did not understand that the bell meant food was coming. They did not have a thought, an idea, a mental representation connecting bell and food. Rather, the sound of the bell directly triggered the physiological response of salvation through a pathway in the nervous system that had been carved by repetition. The dog was, in a sense, a mechanism whose internal wiring had been modified by experience. To ask what the dog felt or thought about the bell was to ask the wrong kind of question. The relevant facts were entirely observable: stimulus presented, response occurred, timing noted, intensity measured. This mechanistic vision extended, in Pavlov's view, to all of human psychology. When a child learns language, they are not grasping meanings or participating in a symbolic order, but forming conditioned associations between sounds and situations. The word mama becomes a conditioned stimulus that elicits approach behavior because it has been repeatedly paired with the presence of the mother and all the unconditioned stimuli. She provides food, warmth, comfort. Complex thoughts are chains of verbal conditioned reflexes, each word triggering the next through learned associations. Emotions are conditioned responses of the autonomic nervous system to stimuli that have been associated with pleasure or pain. Fear of darkness is not a symbolic response to the unknown, but a conditioned emotional reaction based on previous experiences in dark environments, or perhaps on generalization from other frightening situations. When Pavlov's laboratory induced experimental neuroses in dogs by training them to discriminate between stimuli that became increasingly difficult to distinguish, he interpreted the resulting behavioral disturbances as a breakdown in the nervous system's ability to maintain appropriate patterns of excitation and inhibition. Some dogs became agitated and aggressive, others withdrawn and passive. These different neurotic types, Pavlov proposed, reflected differences in the fundamental properties of the nervous system, its strength, its balance between excitatory and inhibitory processes, its mobility or ability to shift from one state to another. Neurosis was not a meaningful response to an impossible situation, not the psyche's protest against contradiction, but a mechanical failure of the nervous system under stress. For Jung, this entire framework was not so much wrong as tragically incomplete, a reduction of the psyche's vast symbolic life to the flattened dimensions of stimulus and response. Learning, in Jung's view, was not merely the formation of mechanical associations, but the unfolding of innate potentials, the activation of archetypal patterns that were already present in the collective unconscious, waiting for the right circumstances to manifest. When a human being undergoes genuine transformation, the kind Jung called individuation, it is not because new associations have been conditioned, but because consciousness has encountered and integrated previously unconscious contents, because the ego has been humbled and expanded through confrontation with the self, because symbolic meanings have been grasped that restructure one's entire orientation to life. Consider a simple example to feel the difference in their approaches. A woman comes to Jung reporting a fear of water, an inability to approach the ocean or even a swimming pool without overwhelming anxiety. Pavlov's approach would be to understand this as a conditioned fear response. Perhaps she nearly drowned as a child or witnessed someone else in danger in water, and the fear became attached to aquatic environments through classical conditioning. The treatment would be to gradually extinguish this conditioned response through exposure, having her approach water in small steps, each time without the feared consequence occurring, until the association between water and fear weakens and disappears. This is the logic behind exposure therapy, behavior modification, systematic desensitization. All therapeutic approaches descended from Pavlovian principles. Jung's approach would be entirely different. He would be interested in the woman's dreams about water, in the symbolic meaning water held for her, in how water appeared in myths and fairy tales and religious traditions as a symbol of the unconscious itself, of the maternal, of purification and renewal, of the depths from which life emerges. He might discover, through amplification and active imagination, that her fear of water was connected to an overwhelming mother complex, that water represented for her the danger of being pulled back into an undifferentiated state, of losing her hard-won individual identity. Or perhaps water symbolized the unconscious materials she had been keeping at bay, and her fear was really a fear of what might arise from her own depths if she allowed herself to be immersed. The healing would come not from mechanical extinction of a conditioned reflex, but from understanding the meaning of the symptom, integrating the archetypal content it pointed toward, and transforming her relationship to the unconscious waters within. For Jung, symptoms were never merely conditioned responses, but messages, communications from the unconscious attempting to compensate for one-sided attitudes of consciousness. If a highly intellectual, rational man develops compulsive rituals, Jung would see this not as conditioned behavior, but as an eruption of the inferior function, the feeling side that had been neglected and devalued, now asserting itself in primitive, compulsive form. If a woman who has always been dutiful and conventional suddenly falls into a passionate, inappropriate love affair, Jung would interpret this not as stimulus-response conditioning, but as the animus, the contrasexual archetype, seizing control because it had been too long ignored, unintegrated. The purpose of psychological life, for Jung, was not adaptation to the environment, Pavlov's implicit goal, but individuation, the development and differentiation of consciousness, the integration of unconscious contents into awareness, the movement toward wholeness. This process could not be programmed or conditioned from the outside. It arose from within, guided by the self, the archetype of wholeness and center of the psyche. Dreams were its primary language, offering nightly commentaries on the ego's current position, warning of dangers, pointing toward neglected possibilities, presenting symbols that could guide the development of personality if they were properly understood. Pavlov's relationship to dreams perfectly encapsulates his divergence from Jung. Pavlov had little interest in dream content and regarded dreams as essentially meaningless random activity of the cerebral cortex during sleep, a kind of noise in the system while various regions of the brain pass through different states of inhibition. He occasionally mentioned dreams in the context of his theory of sleep as partial inhibition of the cortex, suggesting that dreams occurred when some areas of the brain remained active, while others were shut down. The bizarreness of dreams simply reflected this uneven pattern of neural activity, with associations firing without the usual constraints imposed by the waking brain's organized functioning. For Jung, this explanation missed the entire point. Dreams were not noise but signal, not random but highly organized, structured by archetypal patterns and serving a compensatory function for consciousness. Jung spent hours with each dream his patients brought, amplifying the symbols, seeking parallels in mythology and religion, helping the dreamer to understand what the unconscious was attempting to communicate. A dream of being chased by a shadow figure, for example, was not random neural firing, but the psyche's dramatization of rejected parts of the personality, aspects of the self that consciousness had disowned, now pursuing the ego and demanding recognition. A dream of descending into a cave or well represented the movement toward the unconscious depths, the night sea journey that was often necessary for transformation to occur. Jung recounted a famous dream he himself had in 1909, while still collaborating with Freud but already feeling the tensions that would lead to their break. In the dream, Jung was in a house, his own house, he felt, though he had never seen it before. The upper floor was a kind of salon furnished with Rococo furniture. He went downstairs and found himself in a medieval room, darker, with heavier furniture and ancient decor. Then he discovered stairs leading down further into a cellar with Roman brickwork and pottery shards. And below that cellar, another stairway down into a cave carved from rock, where he found bones, skulls, and pottery fragments from the Stone Age. When Jung related this dream to Freud, Freud wanted to know whose skulls these were, assuming they represented death wishes towards specific people. But for Jung, the dream meant something entirely different. The house was the psyche, and its descending levels represented the layers of the unconscious, the personal unconscious, corresponding to medieval and romantic periods, then deeper into the historical unconscious of classical antiquity, and finally into the most archaic layer, the collective unconscious, with its prehistoric, archaic contents. This dream helped crystallize Jung's emerging concept of the collective unconscious as a layer of the psyche deeper than personal memory, containing the inherited forms of human psychological functioning. From Pavlov's perspective, this entire interpretive procedure would seem absurdly arbitrary, reading meanings into chance neural events, the way ancient peoples read omens in the flight of birds. Where was the evidence? How could one verify that a dream of descending into a cave really meant an encounter with the collective unconscious rather than, say, a memory of reading about caves the previous day, or indigestion affecting sleep quality? Jung's method seemed to Pavlov hopelessly subjective, unscientific, a regression to pre-scientific thinking. But Jung would reply that Pavlov's demand for external verification missed the nature of psychological truth. The proof of an interpretation was not in some objective measurement, but in its effect on the patient. Did it resonate with them? Did it open something up, lead to new insights, facilitate the individuation process? Did it feel true at a deep level, even if it could not be proven the way a chemical reaction could be proven? Psychology, Jung insisted, had to deal with meanings and values, not just mechanisms, and meanings could not be captured by the methods of natural science alone. The divide between their methods is equally stark. Pavlov's laboratory was a place of exquisite control. He built what he called the Tower of Silence, a special laboratory where each dog was isolated in a soundproof chamber, suspended in a harness to minimize movement, with devices to deliver precisely timed stimuli and collect precisely measured responses. Salvation was gathered through a tube surgically implanted in the dog's salivary duct so that every drop could be counted. Pavlov controlled the timing of stimuli down to fractions of a second, the intensity of lights and sounds, the type and amount of food, the intervals between trials. He sought to eliminate all extraneous variables, all unpredictability, so that the pure laws of conditioning could be revealed. Jung's consulting room was the opposite of Pavlov's laboratory. Patients came and went on their own schedules. They sat across from Jung in comfortable chairs, speaking freely about whatever arose: memories, feelings, dreams, fantasies, associations. Jung listened with what he called free-floating attention, not directing the conversation toward predetermined topics, but following where the patient's psyche led. Sometimes they analyzed dreams. Sometimes they painted or made sandplay constructions. Sometimes they simply talked about life situations and relationships. Jung even admitted that sometimes he fell asleep briefly during sessions, and his patients later reported that these sessions were particularly helpful, perhaps, Jung speculated, because his own unconscious was then more accessible and could respond to the patient's unconscious in ways that conscious listening could not. Pavlov would have been horrified by such lack of rigor. How could one possibly discover general laws of psychological functioning through such uncontrolled procedures? How could you know whether it was your interpretation, your relationship, your charisma, or some entirely external factor that led to a patient's improvement? Jung's method seemed to Pavlov not science but art at best, self-deception at worst. Yet Jung would argue that Pavlov's methods, for all their precision, could only study the most superficial layers of psychological life. You could measure salvation and paw lifts and skin conductance, but you could not measure meaning, purpose, value, symbol. You could study how quickly a dog learns to respond to a signal, but you could not study the archetypes, the inner figures that populate the psyche, the numinous experiences that transform consciousness. The symbolic process, by which the self emerges from its unconscious depths. These required different methods: amplification, active imagination, dream interpretation, careful attention to synchronistic events, study of comparative mythology and religion. These methods were not less rigorous than Pavlov's, Jung insisted, just differently rigorous, appropriate to a different domain of investigation. The contrast extends to their view of what constitutes psychological data. For Pavlov, the data were observable behaviors, the amount of salvation, the latency of response, the number of trials required for conditioning or extinction. These could be measured with physical instruments and recorded numerically. They were public, objective, replicable. Any competent observer would see the same things and arrive at the same measurements. For Jung, the primary data were subjective experiences, dreams, fantasies, visions, feelings, intuitions, the sense of meaning or its absence. These could not be measured with physical instruments, but only described, interpreted, understood through empathy and imagination. They were private in one sense. Only the patient could directly experience their own dream or feeling, yet they were not merely individual or arbitrary. Dreams drew on universal archetypal patterns. The symbols that appeared in one person's psyche appeared across cultures and epochs, suggesting that they pointed to something objective, something given in the structure of the collective unconscious itself. Jung developed the concept of the archetype, partly to bridge this gap between subjective and objective. An archetype was not a specific image or idea, but a potential, a formal possibility for experience that existed prior to any individual's consciousness. Just as every human infant has the potential to learn language because the brain is structured to process linguistic information, so every human psyche has the potential for certain fundamental experiences: the experience of the mother, the father, the wise old man, the hero's journey, death and rebirth, the sacred marriage, the search for wholeness. These archetypal potentials become activated in particular situations, giving rise to images and emotions that feel both deeply personal and strangely impersonal, both intimately one's own and somehow universal. When a patient dreams of a wise old man who offers guidance, Jung saw this not as a conditioned response based on previous experiences with old men, but as an archetypal figure, the senex, the wise old man archetype emerging from the collective unconscious to compensate for the dreamer's current situation. Perhaps the dreamer had been too caught up in action, in youthful impulsiveness, in identification with the hero archetype, and the psyche was offering a compensatory image of age, wisdom, reflection, experience. The specific appearance of the old man in the dream might be influenced by the dreamer's personal history. He might look like a grandfather or a teacher, but the archetype itself was transpersonal, given in the structure of human experience itself. Pavlov had no patience for such concepts. An archetype could not be observed, measured, manipulated experimentally. It seemed to him a vestige of Platonic philosophy, mysticism dressed up in psychological language. The brain was complex, certainly, with intricate patterns of neural connectivity built up over evolutionary history. But to speak of archetypes as though they were real entities existing in some collective unconscious seemed to Pavlov like reifying abstractions, giving substantial existence to what were merely convenient fictions. And yet, contemporary neuroscience has found something interesting when investigating the brain regions involved in processing certain categories of stimuli. There appear to be specialized neural circuits for recognizing faces, for detecting snakes and spiders, for responding to infant features, for processing spatial navigation, for language acquisition. These are not learned from scratch by each individual, but are built into the brain's architecture through evolution, activated and tuned by experience, but fundamentally given as part of our biological heritage. Are these the neurological basis of what Jung called archetypes? The question remains open, still debated, pointing to the ways that the conversation between Pavlovian mechanism and Jungian meaning continues in contemporary science. Let us consider more specifically how each man would approach a concrete case. Imagine a man in his mid-30s who develops a debilitating anxiety. He cannot leave his house without experiencing overwhelming panic. His heart races, his breathing becomes shallow, he feels dizzy and disoriented, convinced he is about to die or lose control. The anxiety seems to have no clear trigger. It can happen anywhere, anytime. His life constricts as he begins avoiding more and more situations, eventually becoming housebound. Pavlov, if he were to analyze this case, would look for the conditioning history. Perhaps the man had a panic attack in a specific situation. Perhaps he became ill on a bus or nearly fainted in a crowded store. That initial episode, with its intense physical sensations and overwhelming fear, would have functioned as an unconditioned stimulus, producing an unconditioned fear response. But through stimulus generalization, the fear became conditioned not just to the specific situation, but to increasingly broad categories, not just that particular bus, but all buses, not just buses, but all enclosed spaces, not just enclosed spaces, but any situation away from the safety of home. The physical sensations themselves increased heart rate. Rapid breathing became conditioned stimuli that triggered more anxiety in a self-perpetuating cycle. The body's alarm system, which evolved to respond to real danger, had become conditioned to fire in response to its own activation. The treatment, from a Pavlovian perspective, would be to gradually extinguish these conditioned fear responses through exposure. The man would be encouraged to enter feared situations in a graduated hierarchy, starting with minimally anxiety-provoking scenarios and progressing slowly toward more difficult ones. Each time he exposed himself to a feared situation without the catastrophic outcome occurring, the conditioned association between the situation and fear would weaken. Eventually, through repeated exposures, the anxiety would diminish to manageable levels. This is the basis of exposure therapy, one of the most empirically validated treatments for anxiety disorders. Jung would not dismiss the behavioral aspect. He was a careful observer and would certainly notice the patterns of avoidance and the conditioning-like qualities of the anxiety spread. But he would want to know much more about the man's life, his psychological development, what was happening in his inner world when the anxiety first appeared. He would be interested in the man's dreams. He would want to understand what the anxiety might mean, what it might be protecting him from or trying to communicate. Perhaps through dream analysis and careful exploration, Jung might discover that this man had been living a life entirely oriented toward external achievement, toward his persona, the social mask, the role he played for others while neglecting his inner life entirely. He had a successful career, a conventional marriage, all the external trappings of success. But he had never asked himself what he truly wanted, what gave his life meaning, whether this path was really his own or something he had adopted to please his parents, to fit social expectations. The anxiety, Jung might suggest, was the psyche's way of forcing a halt, of saying, "I cannot go on like this. The fear of leaving the house could be symbolically understood as the fear of continuing on a path that was fundamentally false to his true nature. The house represented safety but also confinement, and the anxiety was both a symptom of being trapped in a too small identity and a protective mechanism preventing further movement in the wrong direction. Jung would be interested in any dreams the man had around the time the anxiety began. Perhaps there were dreams of being in a building that was collapsing, or of wearing clothes that didn't fit, or of being chased by something dark and threatening his shadow, the rejected parts of himself pounding at the door of consciousness, demanding recognition. The treatment would involve not primarily exposure to external situations, but exposure to these inner contents, helping the man to recognize what he had been fleeing from, to integrate the disowned aspects of himself, to find a more authentic way of being in the world. As this inner work progressed, Jung would expect the anxiety to diminish naturally, not because it had been extinguished, but because its message had been received and acted upon. Which approach is correct? From a purely pragmatic perspective, exposure therapy works. Countless studies have demonstrated its effectiveness for anxiety disorders. Many people have been helped to reclaim their lives through Pavlovian-derived treatments, but many people also find such treatments insufficient. The anxiety may decrease, but something essential seems missed, and the person may develop other symptoms or fall back into old patterns. Jungian analysis is harder to study empirically. It's long-term, individualized, focused on subjective changes that resist measurement, but many people report profound transformations through depth psychological work that goes beyond symptom removal to fundamental restructuring of personality and life orientation. Perhaps both approaches are addressing different aspects of the same complex reality. The anxiety has both a mechanical aspect, conditioned fear responses that follow predictable patterns, and a meaningful aspect, the psyche's symbolic communication about the person's life situation. Effective treatment might need to address both levels. This kind of integrative thinking, however, would have satisfied neither Pavlov nor Jung fully. Pavlov would insist that the supposed meanings are unnecessary epiphenomena, that the conditioning history is sufficient to explain everything. Jung would argue that treating only the behavioral symptoms without addressing the underlying meaning is like cutting the branches while leaving the roots, offering temporary relief but missing the opportunity for genuine transformation. Their different approaches to human nature flow from fundamentally different philosophical assumptions. Pavlov was a thoroughgoing materialist and determinist. He believed that consciousness, subjective experience, the sense of free will, all of these were either illusions or, at best, epiphenomena that could be safely ignored in scientific explanation. What really determined behavior was the history of conditioning, the current stimulus situation, and the state of the nervous system. A human being was extraordinarily complex, far more so than a dog, with a vast network of conditioned reflexes and the added complexity of the second signal system of language. But in principle, if one knew the complete conditioning history of a person and the current stimulus environment, one could predict their behavior with the same certainty that one could predict a physical event. Jung rejected this determinism as psychologically catastrophic. To view humans as mere products of conditioning was to deny everything that made life worth living: meaning, purpose, creativity, the sense of participating in something larger than oneself. Jung believed that the psyche was purposive, goal-oriented, moving toward the realization of an inner potential for wholeness. Individuation was not determined by past conditioning, but was a creative process, a dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, between ego and self, that could never be fully predicted or controlled from outside. Jung recognized the reality of causation, how the past shapes the present, but he insisted that psychology also needed a teleological perspective, an understanding of how the future, the potential not yet realized, also exerts a pull on present development. A dream might indeed be shaped by past experiences, but it is also oriented toward future possibilities, toward the person the dreamer might become if they heed the dream's guidance. An archetype is not just a residue of evolutionary history, but a potential for experience that reaches forward, calling consciousness toward new levels of integration. This difference in their views of human nature had profound implications for their stance on psychological healing. For Pavlov, healing meant more successful adaptation to the environment. A neurotic was someone whose conditioning history had led to maladaptive patterns, excessive anxiety responses, inappropriate approach or avoidance behaviors, failures of discrimination between safe and dangerous stimuli. Treatment meant reconditioning, establishing new stimulus response patterns that would allow the person to function more effectively in their environment. Jung's vision of healing was much more radical. He spoke of individuation, of becoming who one truly is rather than adapting to external expectations. Sometimes this meant becoming less well adapted in conventional terms. Jung had patients who left successful careers because they realized those careers were betraying their authentic calling, who ended marriages that looked fine from the outside but were spiritually deadening, who made choices that society judged foolish but that felt essential to their soul's development. The goal was not adjustment but wholeness, not fitting in but becoming conscious, not peace but the creative tension of holding opposites together in the personality. Pavlov's laboratory experiments revealed many robust and replicable principles of learning. These principles have proven invaluable for understanding habit formation, skill acquisition, phobias, addictions, and numerous other psychological phenomena. Behavioral therapies based on conditioning principles have helped millions of people. The precision and objectivity of Pavlov's methods set new standards for psychological science and demonstrated that at least some aspects of mental life could be studied with the rigor of physics or chemistry. Jung's explorations of the collective unconscious, archetypes, synchronicity, and the individuation process are much harder to verify empirically. Yet they address dimensions of human experience that Pavlov's framework cannot capture. The search for meaning, the encounter with a numinous, the creative process, the religious instinct, the transformation of personality in the second half of life, the healing power of symbolic understanding these aspects of psychological life seem to require the kind of interpretive, hermeneutic approach Jung developed. His influence on psychotherapy, religious studies, literary criticism, and popular culture has been profound, even if his ideas remain controversial within academic psychology. In their views on consciousness itself, the divide is perhaps most fundamental. Pavlov saw consciousness as, at best, a kind of monitoring device that allowed for more sophisticated conditioning through self-awareness and language. But consciousness played no causal role. It was the conditioning, the stimulus response, connections, that determined behavior. Consciousness was like the glow of a light bulb, a byproduct of the real causal processes occurring in the electrical circuits, perhaps useful for illumination but not actually making anything happen. Jung saw consciousness as central, as the very thing that needed to be developed, expanded, differentiated through the individuation process. But consciousness never existed in isolation. It was always in relationship with the unconscious, always only a small island surrounded by vast unconscious seas. The unconscious was not merely a repository of forgotten memories or conditioned associations, but a living, creative realm that generated dreams, symbols, visions, and impulses that could not be reduced to past conditioning. The dialogue between conscious and unconscious, between ego and self, was the heart of psychological life. When Jung spoke of the self with a capital S, to distinguish it from the ordinary ego, he meant the archetype of wholeness, the organizing center of the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious together. The self was experienced in religious visions, in mandalas that spontaneously appeared in dreams and artwork, in moments of profound meaning when everything seemed to fit together in a pattern larger than oneself. The goal of individuation was not for the ego to become all-powerful, not for consciousness to eliminate the unconscious, but for the ego to recognize its proper relationship to the self, to become the servant of something greater. From Pavlov's perspective, this would seem like mysticism, like a regression to religious thinking that psychology needed to overcome. There was no self, no archetype of wholeness, no collective unconscious, only the brain, with its conditioned reflexes, its patterns of excitation and inhibition, its responses to environmental stimuli. To speak of dialogue between ego and self was to reify abstractions, to treat as real entities what were merely convenient ways of speaking. But Jung would reply that Pavlov's reductionism led to a kind of psychological suicide, a denial of what was most essential in human experience. When a person felt called toward a particular vocation, when they experienced a work of art or a natural scene as numinous, when they fell in love or felt the mystery of their own existence, when they grappled with questions of meaning and purpose, none of this could be adequately understood as conditioned reflexes. To try to reduce these experiences to their supposed mechanical underpinnings was to miss the phenomena entirely, like trying to understand a poem by analyzing the chemistry of the ink. And so we return again to the fundamental divide. Pavlov looked at human beings from the outside, as objects in nature subject to natural laws, and found mechanisms, reflexes, predictable patterns of stimulus and response. Jung looked at human beings from the inside, as subjects of experience, seeking meaning, and found symbols, archetypes, a psyche oriented toward wholeness. Both saw something real, both contributed something essential to our understanding. Yet they could hardly speak to each other across the chasm that separated their worldviews. As you drift deeper into sleep now, imagine for a moment these two men meeting an imaginary conversation that never occurred in history, but that we can conjure in the space of contemplation. They sit across from each other in a room that is neither laboratory nor consulting room, but something in between, a neutral space where dialogue might be possible. Pavlov speaks first, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who has measured and quantified, who has built his understanding on observable facts. Tell me, doctor, Jung, what is this collective unconscious you speak of? Where is it located? Can you show it to me? You speak of archetypes, but I have dissected brains and measured neural responses, and I find only tissue, only reflexes, only the intricate machinery of conditioned associations. Your symbols and meanings seem to me like ghosts, like the superstitions of previous ages. We must build psychology on what can be observed, measured, verified. Otherwise, we are merely inventing elaborate stories, projecting our own fantasies onto nature. Jung listens, his eyes thoughtful, patient, accustomed to being misunderstood by those who approach the psyche from the outside. He responds slowly, carefully, not defensively, but with the gentleness of someone trying to point towards something that must be seen directly to be understood. What you measure, Doctor, Pavlov, is real. I do not deny it. The conditioned reflex exists. Your experiments have demonstrated it beyond question. But you are studying only the surface, only the outer manifestation of psychological life. The psyche is not merely what can be observed from outside. It is first and foremost what experiences, what feels, what imagines, what creates meaning. Your dogs salivate to bells, yes, I accept this. But a human being dreams of a god, creates a cathedral, writes a symphony, sacrifices themselves for an ideal. Can you explain these phenomena through conditioning alone? Pavlov is undeterred. Given sufficient complexity, yes. Language is the key, the second signal system. Words are conditioned stimuli that can be combined in infinite ways, allowing for abstract thought, planning, culture. What you call archetypes are merely common patterns of conditioning that occur across human societies because human environments and human needs are similar everywhere. All mothers feed and care for infants, so all humans develop similar conditioned responses to maternal figures. This does not require positing a collective unconscious or innate archetypal patterns. Learning from experience is sufficient to explain it. Jung shakes his head, not in dismissal but in gentle disagreement. But the child responds to the mother with expectations before any. Learning has occurred. The infant knows to suck, knows to seek the breast, knows to cry when separated. These are not learned. They are given. And the images that appear in dreams, the divine child, the wise old man, the journey to the underworld, these appear in individuals who have had no exposure to the myths where these same images occur. How do you explain that a Swiss patient of mine dreams images identical to those in African tribal myths, in medieval alchemy, in ancient Gnostic texts? These patterns are given in the structure of the psyche itself, as surely as the body's anatomy is given. They are the psychological instincts, the formal patterns around which experience organizes itself. And here we reach an impasse, the point where their two visions cannot be reconciled by argument alone. Each is pointing to something the other cannot see from his position. Pavlov sees the machinery, the mechanical causes, the lawful regularities of behavior. Jung sees the meanings, the purposes, the symbolic dimensions that give human life its depth and texture. Both are real. Both are part of the full picture. But neither man, in his lifetime, could fully acknowledge the validity of the other's perspective. Let us continue our exploration by considering another dimension of their difference, their views on the relationship between individual and society, between personal psychology and collective life. For Pavlov, the individual was shaped almost entirely by their environment. A person's personality, their values, their skills, their desires, all were products of their conditioning history. Change the environment, establish different patterns of reinforcement and punishment, and you could, in principle, reshape human nature itself. This vision appealed to the Soviet regime under which Pavlov lived his final years. If human nature was the product of conditioning, then the right social environment could create the new Soviet man, freed from the superstitions and selfishness of the bourgeois past. Pavlov himself was cautiously enthusiastic about the Bolshevik Revolution, despite being critical of some of its methods. He believed that science, properly applied, could improve human society by establishing better conditions for learning and development. He continued his research under Soviet rule and was given resources and protection even as many of his colleagues suffered persecution. The Soviet state saw in Pavlov's work a materialist, scientific basis for their social engineering projects. Jung, by contrast, was deeply skeptical of all attempts to reshape human nature through external means. The archetypes were not products of social conditioning, but were given in human nature itself. You could not create a new humanity by changing social structures because the fundamental patterns of the psyche would always reassert themselves. Attempt to suppress one archetypal pattern, say, the religious instinct, and it would simply appear in disguised form, perhaps as political fanaticism or obsessive ideologies. The 20th century's totalitarian movements were, for Jung, examples of archetypal possession on a mass scale, the collective unconscious erupting into consciousness with tremendous destructive power because modern rationalism had tried to deny and suppress it. Jung saw the German embrace of Nazism as a possession by Wotan, an ancient Germanic god archetype representing wild, destructive, transformative power. The repressed depths of the German psyche, the archetypal energies that had been devalued by Christianity and then by modern rationalism, had returned with overwhelming force, seizing control of consciousness and driving Germany toward catastrophe. This analysis was controversial then and remains so now, but it reflects Jung's conviction that the collective unconscious is a real force that must be acknowledged and integrated, not ignored or suppressed. For Jung, genuine change happened not through reconditioning, but through individuation, through conscious confrontation with the unconscious, through the integration of shadow and the recognition of one's projections. Society could support or hinder this process, but it could not manufacture it from outside. The transformation had to come from within, from the individual's own encounter with the self. And crucially, Jung believed this work was necessary not just for personal fulfillment, but for the survival of civilization. If individuals did not do the inner work of integration, the repressed contents would erupt collectively in wars, genocides, mass psychoses. Pavlov saw no such depths. Human destructiveness was the product of bad conditioning, of environments that rewarded aggression and competition rather than cooperation and mutual aid. Establish the right social conditions, and human behavior would change accordingly. This was the promise of behaviorism as it developed in the West following Pavlov's work, the idea that humans were infinitely malleable, that through the right techniques of conditioning, we could eliminate crime, poverty, war, all social ills. It was an optimistic vision in some ways, democratic in its implication that anyone could learn anything given the right environment, but it was also, as critics pointed out, potentially totalitarian in its suggestion that human beings could and should be shaped according to some external plan. Jung's emphasis on the inner world, on the autonomous movements of the psyche, on archetypes and the collective unconscious, was in some ways more conservative. It suggested limits to human malleability, patterns that would always reassert themselves. But it was also more respectful of individual uniqueness, of the mystery of each person's path, of the impossibility of reducing humans to predictable mechanisms. Each person's individuation process was their own, following the unique constellation of archetypes and potentials in their particular psyche. No one could do the work for them, and no social engineering could substitute for the individual's conscious engagement with their own depths. In their approaches to specific psychological phenomena, the divergence between Pavlov and Jung appears again and again. Consider the phenomenon of neurosis. Pavlov observed and induced neurotic behavior in his dogs by presenting them with insoluble problems, requiring them to discriminate between stimuli that became increasingly similar until discrimination was impossible. The dogs would break down, some becoming aggressive and chaotic, others passive and withdrawn. Pavlov interpreted these experimental neuroses as breakdowns in the nervous system's ability to maintain organized patterns of excitation and inhibition under impossible demands. Jung saw human neurosis very differently. For him, neurosis was meaningful, purposive, even necessary at times. It was not simply a breakdown, but a kind of breakdown toward breakthrough, a crisis that occurred when the conscious personality had become too one-sided, too narrow, too identified with persona or ego at the expense of the self's larger purposes. The symptom, whether anxiety, depression, compulsion, or psychosomatic illness, was the psyche's way of forcing attention to what had been neglected, of bringing unconscious contents into consciousness where they could be integrated. Jung often quoted the medieval alchemists who said that neurosis was not to be cured, but perfected, transformed. The energy bound up in the symptom was not to be eliminated, but redirected, understood, integrated. A compulsive ritual might be transformed into a meaningful personal ceremony. A troubling repetitive dream might, once properly understood, cease to recur because its message had been received. The goal was not adjustment or the removal of symptoms, but consciousness, individuation, the expansion of personality to include what had been excluded. Pavlov would see this as mystification, as taking a simple mechanical problem, maladaptive conditioning, and wrapping it in unnecessary complexity. Why posit an unconscious with its own purposes when simpler explanations were available? Why speak of transformation and individuation when what was needed was straightforward reconditioning? Jung's approach seemed inefficient, unnecessarily elaborate, more like poetry or religion than science. But Jung would respond that efficiency is not the point, that quick symptom removal often comes at a cost, that the psyche's depth cannot be short-circuited without consequences. He would point to cases where behavioral interventions worked temporarily, but the symptom returned in a different form, or where the person felt emptier despite functioning better, or where the real developmental crisis that the neurosis was pointing toward remained unaddressed. Speed and efficiency were values appropriate to mechanics, but the soul moved at its own pace, and attempts to rush it often backfired. Consider also their different approaches to what we now call trauma. Though neither used that specific term in the contemporary sense, both dealt with the lasting effects of overwhelming experiences. For Pavlov, a traumatic event would be understood as an occasion for strong conditioning, an intensely negative stimulus, producing an intense response, which then becomes associated with all the contextual cues present at the time. The result is a conditioned fear response that can be generalized widely and is resistant to extinction because the original conditioning was so powerful. This Pavlovian understanding has influenced trauma treatment through exposure therapy. The idea is to activate the traumatic memory in a safe context where the feared consequences do not occur, thus weakening the conditioned association between the memory and the fear response. With repeated exposure, the trauma memory becomes integrated into normal memory, losing its overwhelming power to trigger intense reactions. Jung's approach to trauma was, again, more symbolic, more focused on meaning. A traumatic experience shattered the person's worldview, their sense of safety and order. It brought them into contact with archetypal dimensions of experience: death, destruction, the demonic, the total vulnerability of human existence. Healing required not just the extinction of conditioned fear responses, but the integration of this encounter with the archetypal depths, the reconstruction of a worldview that could contain what had been experienced, the finding of meaning in what seemed meaningless. Jung worked with many World War I veterans suffering from what was then called shell shock and we would now call PTSD. He was interested in their dreams, which often depicted archetypal scenarios of death and rebirth, descents into the underworld, encounters with terrifying deities or demons. He understood these dreams as attempts by the psyche to process and integrate the traumatic experience, to find symbolic forms that could contain and transform what had been endured. The healing came not from extinguishing the fear response, but from finding a narrative, a symbolic understanding that could hold the experience within a meaningful framework. Which approach is more valid? Contemporary trauma treatment often combines elements of both the exposure-based techniques derived from Pavlovian learning theory and the meaning-making, narrative reconstruction approaches that owe more to depth psychology. Perhaps trauma has both mechanical and meaningful dimensions. An effective treatment must address both the conditioned fear responses and the shattered assumptions, both the behavioral symptoms and the existential crisis. Their views on emotion also diverged fundamentally. For Pavlov, emotions were complex conditioned responses involving the autonomic nervous system. Fear was a defensive response conditioned to stimuli associated with danger. Anger was an aggressive response to frustration or threat. Love was a constellation of approach responses conditioned through association with pleasure and satisfaction. The subjective feeling of emotion was less important than the observable, physiological, and behavioral responses. By reconditioning the responses, you could change the emotion. Jung saw emotions as laden with meaning, as carriers of psychic energy, as indicators of what mattered to the psyche. A strong emotional response to something signaled that a complex had been activated, an unconscious cluster of associated ideas and feelings surrounding a core archetype. The emotion was not just a conditioned reflex, but a message, pointing towards something significant in the psyche that needed attention. Depression might indicate that libido had withdrawn from the outer world and descended into the unconscious, where it was activating deep contents that needed to be brought to consciousness. Anxiety might signal that the ego was facing a task beyond its current capacity, calling for growth and transformation. Jung encouraged his patients to engage actively with their emotions through imagination. If they felt depressed, they might use active imagination to descend consciously into the darkness, to encounter whatever figures or images emerged from the depressed state, to dialogue with them, to understand what the depression was trying to communicate. This was radically different from Pavlov's approach, which would focus on identifying and changing the environmental contingencies, maintaining the depressed behavior. In their views on development across the lifespan, we again see profound differences. Pavlov's conditioning framework implied that development was primarily the accumulation of learned associations. The infant was born with only unconditioned reflexes, sucking, grasping, orienting responses, and everything else was learned through conditioning. The child's personality, skills, knowledge, values all built up through countless instances of classical and operant conditioning. There was no inherent direction to development, no telos, just the gradual shaping by environmental contingencies. Jung, particularly in his later work, proposed that development followed an archetypal pattern. The first half of life was focused on ego development, on establishing oneself in the world, on achieving external goals, education, career, family, social position. But around midlife, a shift occurred, what Jung called the transition to the second half of life. The values and goals that had motivated the first half of life lost their power. Many people experienced a midlife crisis as the psyche demanded a reorientation from external achievement to inner development, from persona to self, from ego to wholeness. This midlife transition was archetypal. It appeared across cultures. It was depicted in myths and religious texts. It followed predictable patterns. The person might experience it as a sense of meaninglessness, a questioning of all they had achieved, a longing for something more. Dreams might present images of death and rebirth, of journeys into unknown territories, of encounters with divine or numinous figures. If the person resisted this transition, if they tried to continue living by the values of youth, neurotic symptoms often resulted. But if they heeded the call, if they began the work of individuation, the second half of life could become a time of deep fulfillment, of genuine wisdom, of preparation for death, not as an ending, but as a transformation. Pavlov had no framework for understanding such a transition. Why would behavior patterns that had been successful suddenly lose their power? Why would new patterns emerge that had not been obviously conditioned? From his perspective, midlife changes would be explained by changing environmental contingencies, children leaving home, altering reinforcement patterns, declining health, changing what activities were rewarding, social role transitions requiring new learning. But there was no inherent developmental pattern, no archetype guiding the transformation. Jung would say that Pavlov missed the entire dimension of psychological and spiritual development that makes human life meaningful. To reduce the profound transformation of the second half of life to changing environmental contingencies was to miss the phenomenon entirely, like analyzing the chemical composition of paint while ignoring the painting itself. Their different approaches to therapy also reflected their different views of psychological healing. Pavlov himself was not a therapist, but his work directly inspired behavior therapy, which focuses on identifying maladaptive learned responses and replacing them with more adaptive ones. Behavior therapy is directive, structured, focused on specific symptoms and specific techniques for changing them. The therapist is an expert who designs interventions based on learning principles. The therapeutic relationship is less important than the proper application of technique. Jung's analytical psychology was almost the opposite. The therapeutic relationship was central. Jung spoke of the therapist and patient both being transformed through the work of the analysis, being a dialectical process where both participants were affected. The therapist was not an expert imposing techniques, but a companion on the journey into the unconscious, someone who had done their own inner work and could therefore guide another without dominating or directing. The focus was not on specific symptoms, but on the whole person, on their life story, their dreams, their relationship to the archetypes, their movement toward individuation. Jung emphasized that there was no standard procedure, no technique that worked the same way for everyone. Each person's psyche was unique, and the analyst had to respond to what emerged in that particular analysis. One patient needed dream interpretation. Another needed active imagination. Another needed to engage with artistic expression. Another needed to confront their shadow projections in relationships. The analyst had to be creative, flexible, responsive to the living process unfolding between them and the patient. This made Jung's approach extremely difficult to teach or standardize. It required the analyst to be highly developed psychologically, to have undergone their own analysis, to have confronted their own unconscious, to have achieved some degree of individuation. The training was long, intensive, more like an apprenticeship in an art than instruction in a technique. Behavior therapy, by contrast, could be taught more quickly and standardized more easily, because it was technique-based rather than relationship-based. From Pavlov's perspective, Jung's approach would seem hopelessly unscientific, impossible to evaluate objectively, dependent on unmeasurable factors like the analyst's intuition and the patient's capacity for symbolic understanding. How could you know if it worked? What outcome measures would you use? Jung spoke of individuation, of the development of consciousness, of the integration of the self, but how would you measure these? The whole enterprise seemed to Pavlov like a throwback to pre-scientific medicine, where charismatic healers claimed special insights and patients improved or didn't based on factors no one could specify. Jung would acknowledge the difficulty of evaluation, but insist that not everything that matters can be measured. How do you measure whether someone's life has become more meaningful? How do you quantify the sense of having found one's true path? How do you put a number on the integration of the shadow or the encounter with the self? These were real transformations, observable to anyone with psychological sensitivity, even if they resisted reduction to standardized outcome measures. And the proof was in the living. Did the person live more fully, more consciously, more authentically afterward? Did they continue to develop, or did they remain stuck in old patterns? As we move deeper into the night, as sleep pulls you down into your own unconscious depths, consider for a moment the symbolic significance of these two men's lives. Pavlov in his laboratory, measuring salvation drops, controlling variables, seeking the mechanical laws of learning. Jung in his tower at Bollingen, carving stone, painting mandalas, dialoguing with inner figures, seeking the symbolic meaning of the psyche's communications. Both were deeply dedicated. Both devoted their lives to understanding the human being, yet they ended in such different places. Pavlov died in 1936 at 86 years old, still working in his laboratory, still convinced that science would eventually explain all psychological phenomena through the study of conditioned reflexes and higher nervous activity. His last weeks were spent observing and recording his own dying process with the same objectivity he had brought to his dog's salvation. He noted the progression of symptoms, the changes in his mental state, approaching his own death as one final experiment. There is something moving in this commitment to objectivity, even in the face of mortality, this insistence on treating oneself as an object of scientific investigation to the very end. Jung died in 1961 at 85, in his home overlooking Lake Zurich, his tower at Bollingen, a short distance away. His last years were spent writing, refining his ideas, corresponding with scholars and seekers from around the world. He died knowing that his work was controversial, not fully accepted by academic psychology, but also knowing that it had touched something deep in many people, that it spoke to dimensions of experience that scientific psychology often ignored. There is something equally moving in Jung's commitment to the inner life, to following the symbols and meanings wherever they led, even when it meant being misunderstood by his scientific colleagues. Both men were brave in their different ways. Pavlov had the courage to reduce, to insist that the apparently complex was ultimately simple, that consciousness was not the mystery it seemed, that everything could be explained by measurable mechanisms, if only we were patient and rigorous enough. Jung had the courage to complexify, to insist that the apparently simple was ultimately mysterious, that consciousness was deeper and stranger than it appeared, that some things could never be fully explained, but only understood through symbolic participation, and perhaps both were right in their domains. Perhaps behavior does follow lawful patterns that can be conditioned and reconditioned, and perhaps the psyche also contains archetypal depths that speak in symbols and dreams. Perhaps we are both mechanism and meaning, both determined and free, both object and subject. Perhaps the conversation between Pavlov and Jung is really a conversation between two aspects of the human being, both real, both necessary, both incomplete without the other. In the decades since their deaths, psychology has moved in various directions. The behaviorism inspired by Pavlov dominated American psychology for much of the mid-20th century, promising a science of behavior that would rival physics in its precision and predictive power. But by the 1970s, the cognitive revolution challenged behaviorism's dominance, insisting that mental representations and information processing had to be included in psychological explanation. You couldn't understand human behavior without reference to beliefs, expectations, goals, and other mental contents that mediated between stimulus and response. Jung's analytical psychology never achieved the same institutional dominance, remaining somewhat marginal to academic psychology, but it profoundly influenced psychotherapy, comparative, religion, literary criticism, and popular culture. The concepts of archetype, collective unconscious, introversion and extroversion, shadow, anima and animus, individuation, these became part of educated discourse far beyond professional psychology. Jung's approach appealed to those who felt that scientific psychology, in its quest for objectivity and measurement, had lost touch with lived human experience. Contemporary psychology has become increasingly integrative, recognizing that different levels of explanation are all necessary. Neuroscience explores the brain mechanisms underlying psychological processes, the contemporary version of Pavlov's search for the physiological basis of behavior. Cognitive science explores mental representations and computational processes. Evolutionary psychology seeks the adaptive functions of psychological traits. Phenomenological and humanistic approaches emphasize subjective experience and meaning-making, contemporary echoes of Jung's insistence on the priority of lived experience. Psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approaches continue to explore unconscious processes, though often in forms quite different from classical Jungianism. The field has learned that no single level of explanation is sufficient, that the human being is complex enough to require multiple perspectives. We are biochemical systems, neural networks, information processors, evolutionary adaptations, meaning-making creatures, social beings embedded in culture, and conscious subjects experiencing qualia and pursuing purposes. All of these descriptions capture something real, and none is complete in itself. In this contemporary context, the conversation between Pavlov and Jung can be revisited not as a choice between two mutually exclusive alternatives, but as an exploration of different but complementary perspectives. Pavlov showed us that behavior follows lawful patterns, that learning occurs through associative processes, that environmental contingencies shape development in powerful ways. This knowledge has been immensely valuable for treating specific behavioral problems, for understanding habit formation, for recognizing how past experience influences present responses. We should not dismiss or minimize these contributions. Jung showed us that human life is also a symbolic and spiritual reality, that psyche has depths that cannot be accessed through external observation alone, that meaning and purpose are not epiphenomena, but central to psychological health, that development follows archetypal patterns that transcend individual learning history. This knowledge has been equally valuable for understanding the search for meaning, the creative process, the religious instinct, the midlife transformation, the integration of personality. We should not dismiss or minimize these contributions either. Can these perspectives be integrated? The question is difficult because they operate at such different levels, with such different assumptions. A full integration would require a framework that could honor both mechanism and meaning, both causation and purpose, both determinism and autonomy. Such frameworks have been proposed: systems theory, dialectical approaches, enactive cognition, neurophenomenology, but none has achieved consensus. The conversation continues. What seems clear is that neither pure mechanism nor pure meaning is adequate. A psychology that recognizes only conditioned reflexes and environmental contingencies misses the symbolic dimension of human experience, the search for meaning, the yearning for wholeness that motivates so much of human behavior. But a psychology that focuses only on symbols and archetypes and ignores the brain, the body, the lawful patterns of behavior risks floating off into speculation, disconnected from observable reality. The ideal might be a both-and rather than an either-or, a recognition that we need both Pavlov's precision and Jung's depth, both the laboratory and the consulting room, both the objective measurement of behavior and the empathic understanding of subjective experience. We need to know how conditioning works and what dreams mean, how neurons fire and what moves the soul, how habits form and how transformation happens. In your own life, you may recognize both dimensions. There are times when you act from habit, when responses are automatic, when past conditioning determines present behavior. You reach for your phone without thinking, take the same route to work each day, respond to criticism with defensiveness learned in childhood. These are the Pavlovian aspects of your existence, the mechanical patterns that free up conscious attention for other things, but can also trap you in repetitive loops. But there are also times when you act from meaning, when symbols and purposes guide your choices, when something from the depths moves you toward transformation. You have a dream that haunts you for days, shifting your perspective on a relationship. You encounter a work of art or a passage of music that speaks to something in you that has no name. You feel called toward a path you cannot justify rationally, pulled by something deeper than conditioning. These are the Jungian aspects of your existence, the symbolic and archetypal dimensions that make life meaningful. Both are real. Both are you. The behavioral patterns and the archetypal depths, the conditioned reflexes and the autonomous psyche, the mechanical and the meaningful, all of these coexist in the mysterious unity of your being. To honor only one and deny the other is to impoverish yourself, to live in only one dimension of a multidimensional reality. As you drift now into dreams, your conscious mind releasing its grip on waking reality, notice how Pavlovian and Jungian processes both operate in the transition to sleep. There are the conditioned associations, the comfort of your bed, the association between darkness and rest, the habitual rituals that signal to your body that sleep is coming. These are the mechanical aspects, the learned patterns that facilitate the transition. But there is also the opening to the unconscious, the loosening of ego control, the beginning of that nightly journey into the symbolic realm where the psyche speaks in images rather than words. The dreams that will come are not random neural noise, but meaningful communications, compensatory messages, encounters with the archetypal depths. Your consciousness will witness strange dramas, meet mysterious figures, experience transformations that could never be explained by conditioning alone. Both processes are happening. The behavioral machinery of sleep onset the circadian rhythms, the neurotransmitter changes, the shifts in brainwave patterns. All of these follow lawful, predictable patterns that Pavlov would recognize as mechanical processes. But simultaneously, you are entering the imaginal realm, the night sea of the unconscious, where Jung would see the purposive activity of the psyche, the compensatory dreams, the archetypal encounters that serve the individuation process. You are a mystery to yourself, a being who is both mechanism and meaning, both determined and free, both body and soul. Pavlov illuminated one aspect of that mystery. Jung illuminated another. Neither had the complete picture, because the complete picture may be too vast for any single perspective to encompass. But their combined work, their two very different approaches to understanding the human being, gives us a richer, more complete view than either could provide alone. Let us conclude our journey through their intertwining and diverging paths with some final reflections on what their dialogue, spoken and unspoken, reveals about the nature of psychological understanding itself. Perhaps the deepest lesson is that the human being is irreducibly complex, requiring multiple levels of analysis, multiple modes of understanding, multiple languages to even begin to describe adequately. Pavlov's language of stimulus, response, conditioning, extinction, generalization, discrimination, this is a powerful language for describing certain aspects of behavior. It is precise, operational, tied to observable events. It allows for prediction and control. It has generated a vast experimental literature and numerous practical applications. But it is not the only language, and it cannot capture everything that matters about human psychological life. Jung's language of archetype, symbol, individuation, shadow, self, collective unconscious. This is an equally powerful language for describing other aspects of experience. It is evocative, interpretive, tied to subjective meanings. It allows for depth understanding and transformative insight. It has inspired countless individuals in their quest for meaning and wholeness. But it too is not the only language, and it cannot capture everything that matters about behavioral and neural mechanisms. We need both languages, and perhaps many others besides. We need the precision of Pavlov and the depth of Jung, the objectivity of behavior analysis, and the subjectivity of phenomenological description, the measurement of neuroscience, and the interpretation of hermeneutics. Psychology at its best is not a single unified science, but a conversation among multiple perspectives, each contributing its insights, each acknowledging its limitations. This pluralism is not a weakness, but a strength. It reflects the genuine complexity of the subject matter. A simple phenomenon can be described by a simple theory. A vastly complex phenomenon like human psychological existence requires multiple theories, multiple methods, multiple levels of analysis. The attempt to reduce everything to a single explanatory framework, whether that framework is conditioning, information processing, neural mechanisms, or archetypal dynamics, inevitably misses something essential. Pavlov and Jung, in their extreme divergence, show us the range of possibilities for psychological understanding. Between the pole of pure mechanism and the pole of pure meaning, there is a vast territory to explore. Contemporary psychology inhabits this territory, drawing on both traditions and many others, seeking ways to honor both the objective and the subjective, both the explanatory and the interpretive, both the universal and the unique. The debate between these perspectives is not something to be resolved once and for all, but something to be engaged with continually. Each generation of psychologists must grapple anew with the question of how to understand the human being, must navigate between reduction and holism, between mechanism and meaning, between external observation and inner experience. The conversation between Pavlov and Jung, though they never actually spoke, continues in this ongoing exploration. For those who work with suffering individuals, therapists, counselors, helpers of all kinds, the lesson might be to remain flexible, to draw on multiple frameworks as needed. Some problems respond well to behavioral approaches, to exposure and conditioning-based interventions. Others require depth, psychological work, exploration of meaning and symbolism and archetypal patterns. Most require some combination. The skilled clinician, like a skilled musician, must master multiple instruments, multiple techniques, knowing when each is appropriate and how they can complement each other. For those seeking to understand themselves, the invitation is to explore both dimensions of your existence. Pay attention to your habits, your conditioned patterns, the ways your past history shapes your present responses. Notice what triggers anxiety, what produces pleasure, how your behavior is shaped by contingencies. This is the Pavlovian dimension of self-awareness, and it can be liberating to recognize that many of your automatic responses are simply learned patterns that can be unlearned or relearned, but also pay attention to your dreams, your longings, your sense of meaning and purpose. Notice what symbols appear in your imagination, what mythological patterns seem to be playing out in your life, what the deeper movements of your psyche might be trying to communicate. This is the Jungian dimension of self-awareness, and it can be equally liberating to recognize that you are more than your conditioning, that there are depths within you seeking expression, that your life can be guided by purpose as well as pushed by past causes. Both forms of self-awareness are valuable. Both contribute to psychological growth and development. You are not required to choose between being a mechanism and being a mystery. You are both. And the integration of these perspectives in your own self-understanding can lead to a richer, more complete sense of who you are and who you might become. The story of Pavlov and Jung is ultimately a story about the many-sidedness of truth, about how the same reality can be described from different perspectives, each revealing something the others miss. It is a story about the importance of humility in the face of complexity, about recognizing that our theories and frameworks are tools for understanding, not reality itself. It is a story about the ongoing dialogue that constitutes psychological science and practice, a conversation that continues long after any individual contributor has passed. As you settle now into complete rest, as consciousness releases its hold and you sink into the depths of sleep, Carry with you this image of two paths diverging in a wood one, leading toward the laboratory, toward measurement and mechanism, toward the reduction of mystery to knowable patterns. The other leading toward the tower, toward symbol and meaning, toward the embrace of mystery as irreducible depth. Both paths are real. Both lead somewhere valuable. And in your own life, you will walk both at different times, guided sometimes by the lessons of Pavlov, sometimes by the wisdom of Jung, and ideally by some synthesis that honors both their visions. The night is deep now. Your breathing has slowed. Your body has relaxed. Your conscious mind has begun to withdraw from the world of waking concerns. Soon you will dream, and in those dreams, perhaps you will encounter something that speaks to the depths. Jung explored archetypal figures, symbolic scenarios, messages from the unconscious, seeking to balance and compensate for the one-sidedness of waking consciousness. But the very mechanism of dreaming, the neural processes that produce these nocturnal visions, would remind Pavlov that we are embodied creatures, biological organisms whose psychological life is grounded in physiological processes, however mysterious those processes may remain. Sleep now, wanderer. Rest in the knowledge that you are both mechanism and mystery, both determined and free, both a product of your past and a project moving toward your future. You are the meeting place of Pavlov's world and Jung's world, of outer and inner, of behavior and psyche, of explanation and understanding. In you, as in every human being, these two great streams of psychological thought find their lived synthesis, their concrete unity in the actual experience of a life being lived. The conversation between these two giants of psychology continues in you, in your habits and your dreams, in your conditioned responses and your archetypal encounters, in your search for both effective, functioning, and deep meaning. May you honor both voices, both visions, both paths. May you be precise where precision serves you, and embrace mystery where mystery enriches you. May you understand yourself as both mechanism and meaning, both process and purpose, both effect and cause of your own becoming. And may this night's rest restore you. May your dreams bring messages from the depths, and may you wake tomorrow more conscious, more integrated, more whole. The dialogue between Pavlov and Jung, between mechanism and meaning, between outer and inner, continues endlessly in the vast mystery of human psychological existence. Sleep now, and let that dialogue continue in the quiet workings of your own psyche, in the space between waking and dreaming, in the eternal conversation between the measurable and the mysterious. Welcome to the realm of sleep, where Pavlov's mechanisms and Jung's meanings dissolve into the deeper unity of lived experience, where you are neither purely conditioned nor purely archetypal, but simply, mysteriously, yourself. Rest well, traveler. The journey of self-understanding continues in dreams, and in the morning you will wake to walk again the paths these two great thinkers illuminated, carrying forward their dialogue in your own unique life.